I made some comments on Instagram on some trauma therapy post, and I have never had so many responses to a comment, actually several comments, and my comments were somewhat unpopular. And so I decided I want to clarify a little bit more about what I'm talking about when I say maybe we should stop poking at trauma. That is not to say that recovering from trauma cannot it's not easy. Recovering from trauma is not easy. It is very painful. Trauma is very painful. Trauma can be viewed in one person's eyes as, I don't understand why that person thinks that's traumatic, and then other people experience trauma that we can totally validate. And so that's kind of a place to start, is what is trauma and how do I know if I've been traumatized? So when we take a look at that subject, what is trauma? Trauma is any experience that you've had that has shaken you in some way in a shocking experience. And it doesn't always mean, it's not always about sexual abuse. Trauma is not always sexual abuse. Sometimes just living with someone, I'll give you an example of trauma. When I was growing up, I had a friend whose mother was a complete OCD clean freak who was addicted to the big tall Pepsi Cola bottles. This is like way back in the 60s when Pepsi Cola came in these big giant bottles in 6-packs, and her mother drank 2 6-packs of those a day and cleaned her house incessantly. And this friend of mine had developed a nervous tic of pulling out her eyebrows and her eyelashes. I wonder why. She was being traumatized by her mother. The whole family was traumatized by this woman who didn't want anything out of place in her house. You were not allowed to sit. Her furniture was covered with plastic. There were runners on her floor. She was trying to keep the world clean and orderly because she also has suffered some trauma in her life. But unfortunately, her response, the OCD development, trying to control everything, that's what OCD is all about, was now traumatizing her daughter in a completely different way than she may have originally been traumatized. So having somebody, I have a friend whose mother is elderly, but her mother has always been this way. She is narcissistic. We're going to talk about the kinds of people that will traumatize other individuals, and narcissists are traumatizing. Just to have a relationship with them is traumatic. And so it's not always easy to recognize that, because the narcissist makes you feel like everything is your fault. And this woman has had a very serious injury and has been in the hospital for over a month, and she's getting ready to go back home. She lives with her mother to take care of her in her older years. And the first thing her mother said to her when she was talking to her about that she was coming home on Thursday from the hospital was, "Well, are you going to be nice to me?" That's a hook. My friend immediately reacts. There's a vibrational energy that goes out when a narcissist throws out a hook. The vibrational energy of, this is pushing my buttons. They've already got you. You're already vibrating to the energy of abuse from them. And then you have to make a decision. How am I going to respond to this? How am I going to defend myself? Like, this is a constant assault against you. And it's oftentimes very difficult to recognize the relationship with this individual is traumatizing. It isn't trauma that happened. It's not like a car accident. I was in a really severe car accident a number of years ago. A woman hit me going 60 miles an hour from the rear. That's traumatic. We know that. It's traumatic to the physical, emotional, spiritual, energetic body. I had brain injury. Very easy to identify that's traumatic. It's much less easy to identify that your trauma may be coming from somebody who's manipulative. You may be having trauma on the job every single day. You may have a coworker or someone that a person who can never be made happy. I worked at a location once when I first started my practice where I shared space with a woman who owned the business there, and nothing I did ever made her happy. And after a while, I just felt like she was rubbing a hole right through me. And a dear friend of mine said, don't feel like you're failing. A toxic person can rub a hole right through you. So it started to become traumatic, and then it was affecting my clients as well. One of my clients said to me one day, your energy is really getting weird. And I knew I have to find another place to practice because this person is affecting me. So when we are in relationships with people who are cruel, who are narcissistic, who are manipulative, we're often reenacting a relationship that we may have had in our family with a parent or with both parents. And so we're now learning how to continue to victimize ourselves. And so now the layering of trauma just starts to build. So trauma is not always just one thing. The car accident for me was definitely a traumatic injury, and I could deal with it as that isolated traumatic injury. But people experience trauma that builds up in layers over time. Perhaps you live in a family and you're a victim of sexual abuse by one member of the family, and then maybe you get into a relationship later on in your life where someone else is kind of victimizing you in a sexual way. Or maybe you have had multiple experiences of being victimized sexually over a long period of time. And sexual abuse trauma is not always just limited to actual touching. Sometimes having an uncle or a cousin or someone who's just looking at you salaciously, maybe even somebody who might be secretly watching you undress, or wanting to throw water on you and get your t-shirt wet so that they can see your breast. It can often be very subtle. People who are visualizing having a sexual experience with you or imagining what they would do. I was in high school and I was in the band, and in my freshman year of high school, one of the older band members, a guy, came up behind me and grabbed my crotch and yanked me up by my crotch and said, hey, if you ever want something to happen down here, I'm your guy. I'm like, 14, 15 years old? That's scared the shit out of me, for one thing. But then it became a cumulative traumatic experience with men in general. And so I think it's important for women and men to understand that women carry trauma related to DNA, experiences that are trapped within the DNA of fear of men. Most women have had inappropriate sexual experiences of one kind or another, whether or not it involves touching. It could be just innuendos, sexual remarks. I worked at a job. I was one of the first women to work as a landscape person at a golf course in the area where I grew up while I was in college. And from the moment I got to work in the morning till the end of the day was nothing but one sexual innuendo after another. I was treated not the same as the younger men who also had the same position that I was. We were just called groundskeepers, and they were allowed to learn how to operate equipment, and I wasn't allowed that opportunity. I got all the mundane jobs. I had to clean bathrooms. I had to clean the kitchenette area of our little workers' shack that we stayed in. Every day was a constant assault. That happened to be the same year that the women in the coal mines in Wisconsin won the case against sexual harassment in the workplace and equal pay for women. So we need to understand that just as a woman, we often have experienced trauma. If you've been married more than once, if you've had a toxic marriage, whether you're a male or female, you are often have been in a relationship with someone who's very toxic, and that is traumatizing. So if you think about all of the people who have been traumatized or are currently actively being traumatized by other people, the average person, I just had this conversation with my daughter this morning, the average person is traumatized, or the average person who's really toxic and dysfunctional, their life, the energy of their dysfunction is affecting on average 63 other individuals directly. That's a lot of people being affected by one sort of narcissistic, controlling, dominating, whatever person. And then you have those people that are walking around in the world, and that energy is interacting with a whole bunch of other people. And when you look at that energetically, from the perspective of all the people in our culture, that's a lot of toxic energy roaming around out there. So the typical response when we're not even aware that we're traumatized is to develop ways of coping with the internal pressure of all this energy that's built up inside of you. And so then we move into addictions, whether it's OCD, whether it's shopping, whether it's drinking or drugs or coffee, like running, overworking, HIIT classes, and over exercising, this constant need to be achieving all the time. This is all ways that we have of trying to escape and run away from what is within the interior landscape, because trauma, the energetic effect of trauma, lives in the visceral tissue of the body. So that makes us uncomfortable because we're living with this trauma energy in our body, and we try to find ways to be away from it. So that's sort of my first installment about trauma. And in the next conversation I have, I'm going to be discussing trauma and therapy. That's my pet topic for the next time. Thank you so much for tuning in. Vanessa Goldine. I have a wellness practice here in Scottsdale, Arizona. I have a current series out called What Does This Crazy Lady Do? That explains what I do and why I do it. It's the result of 45 years of studying and trying to understand the process of healing for human beings so that we can move on from our trauma and enjoy our life more. Many blessings.